Good day, everyone. Thank you for staying for my talk. I hope you enjoyed your lunch. My name is Israel Halperin. As introduced, I'm a senior lecturer at Sylvan Adams Sport Institute and the Sackler Faculty of Medicine at Tel Aviv University. Today, I'll be speaking with you about a topic that is very dear to my heart. It's about how to bridge the gap between science and practice. And my focus today will be the coach's component. How can I get you more engaged in using strategies to become a better decision maker as a coach? So first, I'd like to introduce myself. The reason for that relatively extensive introduction is not because I want to toot my own horn, but rather because I think that you will appreciate what I have to say, what I'll try to the message that I'm going to try to get across today will be better understood in view of my background. So if we go back in time, for many years I was a competitive athlete. I competed professionally and internationally in a number of combat sports, kickboxing, boxing, mixed martial arts. I got to travel the world. I spent a few years in the States, a few years in Thailand, Europe. Got to train with many different coaches. But then, like many other athletes, I got injured. At some point, I decided I had enough, and my natural transition was to become a coach. I'm a coach to this day. I work both as a strength and conditioning coach and as a technical martial arts coach. I work and have worked with many elite-level athletes, national, international, and Olympic-level athletes. I also spent a few years in the Australian Institute of Sport, working as a support staff or a sports scientist with a number of the Olympic teams preparing for the Rio Olympics. And then finally, I'm also a researcher. And as a researcher, I take great interest in studying applied ways to enhance athletic performance. What I grew to learn over the years is that I view a problem, a coaching-related problem, from different perspectives. And every angle or every lens that I put on, I can see the problem a bit differently. And I think that every lens or every perspective allows us to appreciate the problem in a more complex way, which is what led me to develop a great interest on the topic that I'll be discussing with you about today. So this will be the plan of my talk. I will start with a description or introduction to the evidence-based practice framework. Now, right now, even as we speak, I'm curious. Has anyone here ever heard of the evidence-based practice framework? If you can just raise your hand so I'll know. All right, so a few of you. Okay. So at first, I'll just describe what the model is, what stands behind it, briefly going over the history, because I think that it's an excellent framework to coach through. That really can serve you when you coach. Afterwards, I will discuss the pros and cons, the strengths and weaknesses of two different types of information based upon we make decisions. On the one hand, as coaches, we like to rely on our own experiences, working with athletes for years and years, gathering a lot of useful experience, and then when we make future coaching-related decisions, we tend to rely on the knowledge that we acquired through years of experience. So we'll talk about some of the obvious strengths of relying on that type of knowledge, but we'll also be talking about some of the weaknesses that is associated with this type of knowledge, with our own experiences. And then we'll do the same thing with research. Research clearly has some benefits. I definitely do think that as coaches, we can do a lot by relying on some of the scientific outputs when we make coaching-related decisions, but also research has some weaknesses that we got to acknowledge. And just by discussing that explicitly, that alone, I think, should already improve your decision-making processes as a coach. And the way I see coaching is that, in a sense, it's a decision-making process. That's what we do as coaches. We make decisions. If we improve our ability to make decisions, we naturally become better coaches. So this is, in a sense, what I'll be trying to get at with you today. And then I'll conclude my talk with proposing 6 different strategies to become a better evidence-based practitioner, an evidence-based coach. These strategies, for the most part, are not going to be very time-consuming. I realize how busy you all are. But they will require some effort that I think is definitely worthwhile. So let's get started. Let's talk about evidence-based practice, the framework. So just a few words about the framework, because as I said before, I hope that after my talk, you'll rely a bit more on this model when you reflect upon your own coaching. So starting in the 90s, in Canada, a number of medical professionals developed a term. It started out as evidence-based medicine. And it evolved dramatically over the past 30 or so years. Ever since it originated, there's been over hundreds, if not thousands, of books and articles on this topic. There's a lot of controversy involved, some agreement and disagreement evolution, which we're not going to discuss about here. But what I will say is this. There are two main outcomes that were born out of this framework. The first is that it proposed and develops different systems to rank evidence, to rank knowledge, which is very interesting when we think about it. Is some type of knowledge base better than the other? The quality of it? Can we even rank different types of knowledge? That's one thing they proposed. And the second thing, which is what I'm going to focus about today with you, is they proposed and developed different strategies to integrate knowledge when we make decisions. And my focus today will be on the integration part, but nevertheless, I prepared one slide to give you a taste of what they refer to when they talked about ways to rank the quality of evidence. Okay, so this is a pyramid that perhaps you've seen in the past at some point. There are many types of this pyramid, but the main point here is that you see that there is a ranking system. The higher up we go in the pyramid, so to speak, the quality of evidence is considered higher. It's cleaner, it's more objective, it's less biased, it's something that is more trustworthy. The lower we go, according to this pyramid, the quality of the evidence becomes more noisy, more biased, and somewhat less reliable. According to the evidence-based model, when it originated, they ranked expert opinion quite low in that pyramid, which is something that I personally disagree with from a coaching perspective. But nevertheless, this is something that has evolved a lot. There's many different types of pyramids, how we rank different types of knowledge, and it's an interesting question. But we're not going to focus about this. I just wanted to introduce the concept because I think it is interesting. This is what I'll be focusing about, and this is hopefully that this figure is something you'll take away from this presentation and you'll reflect upon it and use it in your future work. This is the second outcome, or one of the key outcomes from this framework, which is how we should integrate different types of knowledge when we make a decision. And soon I will define what I mean by a decision, so it's not going to be just something abstract in the air. So as I mentioned earlier, one of these circles represents expertise or experience that based upon the experience that we've gained through coaching, working with athletes, interacting with them, we developed a very large body of knowledge, right? We worked with athletes, many different athletes from different types, personalities, and different settings. We definitely gained a lot of useful experience that led into the development of expertise. And then when we make future decisions, we draw from this channel of knowledge to make future decisions. That makes perfect sense. I would say that most coaches, that is the channel that they rely mostly upon. Then there's the research channel, which is here represented by a circle. There's a lot of scientific output being published in sports science. We can draw upon all of these different types of outputs and integrate that into our decision-making process as coaches, as I'm sure a lot of you do as well. And then there's also the third circle, which is I'm not going to talk about at all at this presentation, but the next one will solely revolve around the topic of client, or in our case, athlete preferences. How do we integrate that into a decision? And this diagram proposes that we should draw from all these different types of channels of knowledge or channels of information, try to integrate them, and then we make a decision. So this is where the decision process should happen. Now, what do I mean by a decision? A decision is essentially anything that you do on a regular, daily basis as a coach. you got to decide, you're going to request your athlete to complete an X number of sets, number of repetitions, what are going to be the order of the exercises or the order of the techniques or the drills that you're going to have your athletes do. That's a decision. That's a coaching-related decision. How long of a rest are you going to provide between the different exercises? When will you provide technical-related feedback? After the first set, after the third set, when your athletes require that? All of that falls under the umbrella of decisions. So I'm not sure how many of you here truly thought about coaching as almost purely a decision-making process. Because when I started thinking about coaching as a decision-making process, it slightly changed my views of myself as a coach and of the profession. Now, the diagram that I just showed you with the 3 circles, there's something a little bit deceiving about it because it is static. It gives us the impression, I'll actually go back again. See, when we look at the figures, it may give us the wrong impression that every time that we make a decision, it should be an even split between the channels. That a third of my decisions should be based on my experience, a third should be based on the research, and a third should be based on the athlete's preferences. But this is not the case. This is one of the problems that we have with this static diagram that influenced me for many years, just because it never occurred to me that this is not how it actually works. So what actually happens, and this is something I put together because just to illustrate that sometimes there is some tension between the different channels, right? You all, I'm sure, experienced this before. Coaches like to rely more on the experience. Scientists like to rely more on the sciences. So there's like a tug of war, which is fine. But my point is that the decision-making process is dynamic. We don't have to rely an even split on all of the 3 channels. Because, for example, I may encounter an athlete who has a particular type of injury. He's recovering from a particular type of, let's say, hamstring injuries. I'm just making it up on the spot. This is not based on actual data, just to give you an example. And let's say that me as a coach, I've worked with many athletes that suffer from the particular type of injury. I developed a lot of expertise already throughout the past 20 years. I worked with, let's say, 12 athletes that had the same type of injury, and I helped them through the process of getting better. So in a case like that, I've got a lot of rich and relevant experience that is relevant to the problem I'm encountering with this particular athlete. However, let's say that there is not a whole lot of high-quality research on this particular injury and how I can get an athlete back to the sport as soon as possible. So let's say that the research channel here is rather slim. And let's say that the athlete doesn't have a particular preferences. It's not that he prefers to, or he wants to avoid doing a particular exercise or something of that nature. So in a situation like that, my decision process will rely mostly on my expertise. However, I could also encounter a particular, let's say, athlete that needs to improve their maximal, their vertical height, for example, their jump performance. And let's say that me as a coach, I come from a combat sport perspective. We don't really care as much about vertical jumping. So let's say that I don't have that much experience working with volleyball players trying to improve their vertical jump. So in a case like that, I wouldn't have a lot of experience. I haven't developed a whole body of relevant information or knowledge that will assist my decision-making process. But there's a whole lot of research out there that has looked into how we can improve jumping performance. And it's of high quality, and there's a lot of replications, and it's relevant to volleyball players. And then let's, again, assume that the preferences here are constant, that the athlete doesn't have clear preferences one way or the other. So in a case like that, my decision-making process will rely heavily on the research component. So the take-home message here is that the integration of these different channels is a moving target, and it changes from athlete to athlete, from day to day, from a particular problem to a particular problem. But nevertheless, you want to be conscious of the fact that it should have some percents of each of the 3 channels, and we'll get back to that later on. So now, my first quick question to you, just to get you a bit more involved. We'll use the phones for that. So which of the 3 channels do you rely the most on when you make coaching-related decisions? Is it on the research? Is it on the client preferences, or in this case, what your athletes prefer to do? Or is it on your own experience or expertise that you've gained throughout the years? Let's give it another like 30 seconds or so. So I'll be happy to see a few more responses just to get a more representative sample. The results are not surprising at all, but nevertheless, it's interesting to see that we get some that have answered research. All right, so the results are not surprising, as I'm sure nobody is surprised for the results, but nevertheless, it's interesting to see this occurring. Okay, let's move on. We've covered the background of it, and hopefully what I would like you to have gotten out of the first part of my talk is the diagram of the 3 circles, and to keep in mind that the decision-making process is not static, as the figure sometimes deceives us into thinking, but rather it's dynamic. And the second point is that I think, and we'll get to that again later on, but so far I like to plant the seed, so to speak, into realizing that the decision-making process should have all 3 components, for the most part. You can rely more so on one of these channels compared to the others, but trying to integrate all 3 is ideal. Now let's explicitly discuss some of the advantages and the disadvantages of the 2 main channels, research and experience. And the reason why I like to discuss about that is because both as a coach and as a researcher, I see that there's a lot of tension. Depending on the camp, so to speak, that I sit in, I see that a lot of coaches are dissatisfied with some of the way science is done or working with sports scientists. I've experienced that working in Australia, in Canada, in Israel. So I know that the problem exists. And then a lot of times scientists think that we should rely more on science when we're making decisions. Who's right? The reality is that both are right. And the reason why we don't see more of that integration is because coaches and scientists speak different languages. So my goal here is just to first discuss these advantages and disadvantages of each of the 2 channels. And I think that by learning about that, it'll be easier for you to make decisions when you make them. Let's make it all explicit. So let's now focus on the expertise channel. And let's discuss some of the strengths. Why should we rely on our own experiences when we make a coaching-related decision? So over the years, as we coach, we develop a very deep body of knowledge of a specific sport domain. And that by itself almost doesn't need any explanation because it's obvious. It's something that is unique, and in fact, it's unique to each and every coach that is working in their own particular settings. Every coach, the way he interacts or she interacts with their athletes, has their own little universe that has its own little rules. So you develop a rich body of knowledge that's relevant to your own coaching settings. You gain experience with very complex individuals rather than statistical entities that they exist in the research world, but we work with complex individuals. And you as coaches, or I should say we as coaches, we don't have any choice, we have to account for many different variables when we make coaching-related decisions. We have to account for whether our athletes ate enough, or they slept, or they're in a bad mood, or they broke up with a boyfriend or girlfriend, and game schedules, and the list goes on and on and on. And we have to somehow account for all of that when we make a decision. In scientific research, we actually don't have the ability to control or to account for so many variables. This is only something we can do in practice. So this is actually, I've only got one slide discussing the strengths of relying on our expertise when we make decisions. It's not to say that it's not important. I think that this slide and the points that are on here have a very heavy weight. But now let's discuss some of the weaknesses, which I think are very crucial for coaches to understand and accept as well. So first, I'm sure that all of you here at one point said, or at least heard somebody else said, a coach said, I've seen the improvement with my own two eyes. I've seen that happen. I've seen the athlete improve. But then I'll ask you, which of the two lines here is longer? I imagine that all of you here realize that this is a visual illusion, that you've seen that, you've encountered this illusion in the past. So you know, or at least I presume that you know, that the lines are exactly the same length. But what's amazing is even after I tell that to you, that they're exactly the same length, it still doesn't change the fact that you see the upper line as being longer than the lower line. And then if I had a survey here with the phone and I would ask you how many legs does this elephant have, I'm sure we'll get responses that are going to be all over the place. So what does it tell us? It tells us that our senses sometimes trick us into seeing things that are not an accurate representation of reality. And this is important to acknowledge. We're also meaning-making machines. So we like to think that one intervention is the reason of the outcome. We like to think, here we go. For example, we gave our athlete, let's say, some type of a nutritional supplement. Let's say we gave him vitamin C. And then all of a sudden we see that the athlete improved their sprinting performance. Our natural tendency is to attribute a cause and effect relationship. We immediately rush into making cause and effect relationships. Now we will automatically think that the reason our athlete is sprinting faster is because he started taking vitamin C. Even though there could be some alternative explanations as to why our athletes all of a sudden started sprinting faster. This, by the way, is exceptionally true with young athletes. So there's a few X's here, and the X's here are possibilities of alternative explanations as to why the athlete started running faster. Now, I'm not saying that the nutritional supplement could not be a reason, but surely you can think of other reasons why the athlete, especially youth athlete, started running faster, right? For example, it could be that the athlete started performing resistance training. And we do know, there's a large body of knowledge right now, that resistance training can definitely improve sprinting performance. So now we got to ask ourselves, well, wait, did the athlete improve their running performance because of the nutritional supplement or because they started performing resistance training? Another possibility that the athlete improved their diet. They started eating better. We know that there's quite a strong relationship between dietary habits and athletic performance. Perhaps they improved their sleep. So all these are just some alternative explanations that could explain the outcome, that can explain why our athletes improved performance. But we tend to focus on one and put all our faith into one explanation. Which leads me to the next point. We're still under the weaknesses category of relying on our own experience and expertise when we make decisions. And this is essentially just an extension of everything I've said up until now. We humans, this is universal, we humans suffer from a number of cognitive biases. Our minds play tricks on us. Our memory is malleable. And I'll give a few examples, and just so you'll know right now, the list is endless. There's so many different biases that influence our thinking and cloud our judgment. And when our judgment is clouded, we naturally make suboptimal decisions. And as coaches, that, of course, because coaching is a decision-making process, if there's all these different biases that are influence and cloud our judgment, then we may not be making optimal decisions. Confirmation bias, I don't know if you've ever heard of that before, but it's been defined as the mother of all biases. What it is that we think that we see something, or we believe that there is a relationship. Let's say, going back to the previous example, we believe that the nutritional supplement is what led to the athlete's improvement in sprinting speeds. And now that I've established in my head that there's a cause and effect relationship, that the vitamin C is the cause of the athlete running faster, then if the confirmation bias will affect me now, what's going to happen is I'm going to actually actively look only for evidence that support my belief, and I will ignore everything that doesn't go hand in hand with that, everything that disagrees with this belief of mine. There's other types of biases, such as appealing to authority. So for example, if I told you all right now, trust me, I know what I'm talking about, and you would trust me blindly, then you'll be appealing to authority. And there's a whole the list is endless, and all these things could influence us and take away from our ability to make good choices. So I'd like to get you thinking a little bit. So I briefly defined the confirmation bias, and I can guarantee you this. Everyone in this room has been affected by the confirmation bias, in which we believe in something. Once we believe in something, I should say, we start looking for evidence that reinforce our belief, and we disregard or ignore evidence that collides with it. So what I like to do is just try to take a minute and think and try to be as honest as you can with yourself. If you can think of an example, a coaching-related instance in which confirmation bias may have influenced or tricked your mind into believing something that perhaps later on you found out to be true. This, as I will shortly explain, is probably one of the best strategies to become better decision-making coaches, is just to be really honest with ourselves and about accepting some of the disadvantages that we as humans all have. So we'll give it another 20 seconds. See a lot of yes, that's great. I can think of endless amounts of examples that the cognitive bias, that the confirmation bias influenced my thinking, that later on I found that I was wrong. Okay, last point is that naturally as coaches, we work with a limited amount of athletes at a time. So that sometimes, the knowledge that we acquire through our experience is usually on single or very small numbers. That could be an outlier. That could not be a representative of the athletic population that we're working with, and then we tend to generalize from one example or a few examples to others. Just like we can't generalize that the fact that this lady here is smoking and lived to be 100, that smoking is healthy. So we got to be careful with the amount of certainty that we place on anecdotes. All right, let's now conclude this section. Let's recap what the pros are of relying on the knowledge that we acquired through experience. Now the pros, the strengths of it, is that we developed and acquired very rich, complex, and domain-specific knowledge concerning our sport that concerns unique individuals with unique requirements. And that to me means a lot. That is a lot of very useful and insightful information that we should integrate heavily when we make decisions. However, we should also be mindful of the fact that our minds play tricks on us, that we're susceptible to different biases, confirmation bias, and the list goes on, different visual illusions, like I demonstrated. We assume relationships when in fact they don't exist. We create a lot of cause and effect relationships when they're not there. And we tend to rely too heavily on anecdotes. So again, just to reinforce this point, I think that the knowledge acquired through experience is extremely important, but it also has its weaknesses, and you gotta be well aware of that when you account for it. All right, now let's talk about research. So what I'm gonna do right now, I want you to be mindful of a very interesting fact, that the research, when I decompose the research, when I'll talk about the strengths and weaknesses of research, what you'll notice that it complements the expertise channel quite nicely. So the weaknesses of personal experience are actually the strengths of research and vice versa, which is why I think it's so important to integrate the two. So let's talk about the strengths of research. Why should we as coaches integrate and consume scientific outputs when we make decisions? the biggest strength that I see as a coach and as a sports scientist is as a scientific method, if done properly, and that is an assumption, it doesn't always have to be the case, but if done properly, the scientific method or a particular study designs can overcome many of the weaknesses that we've just discussed in the personal experience channel. The scientific method can overcome a lot of the biases, and it can overcome a lot of the illusions, making that type of knowledge more objective, less biased, and in many ways more reliable. So there's many definitions of what scientific method even is. It's not something that is that easy to define. But I think that this part of the definition of the scientific method makes it so powerful, at least to us coaches. The scientific method, or more specifically, particular study designs, can allow us to establish a cause and effect relationship. Now, I just want to make something clear. We as coaches, our biggest interest is in cause and effect relationship. That's what interests us. And it may sound unclear what cause and effect relationship is, but in a sense, when I say, I think that my training intervention is working, in a sense, what we're doing is establishing a cause and effect relationship. The training intervention, let's say stretching. Let's say I think that stretching assisted my athlete with his recovery. By this statement is essentially attributing a cause and effect relationship between stretching and recovery. So this is really what we care about. And the scientific method allows us to establish cause and effect relationship better than any other method. And that means a lot. This is why I believe, if nothing else, we should integrate the scientific outputs into our work, because it allows us to establish with a great degree of certainty cause and effect relationships, which is what we really care about. You want to know whether what you do is effective. You want to know whether what you do helps your athletes. This is one excellent way to assist us being sure that this is indeed the case, that what we're doing is effective. Another strength is that the scientific method can help us overcome the danger of relying too heavily on anecdotes. For the most part, when we do studies, we usually have larger samples. And we have larger samples and we're finding consistent effects, then we can say with a greater degree of certainty that the effect is indeed real, it's there. Now, the next point is I think, very important to acknowledge. Research is very informative at the group level. This, by the way, what I'm saying right now, I think lies at the very heart of the miscommunication between scientists and coaches. Scientific outputs should help you make decisions at the group level, because this is usually what we do. We take a group of athletes and have them do one type of, let's say, training program, and we compare them to another group of athletes who are doing a different type of program, and we see what happens over time. We compare the two groups. So as an example, and this, of course, is mostly just to visually illustrate my point, you see a graph here. Let's say that for the sake of the example, I took 100 young athletes, all at the same age group, all the same, same strength, same everything for the sake of this discussion, and we randomized them into two separate groups. Group 1 will go through plyometric training. Group 2 will go through barbell training. And they both train for a similar period of time, and we compare their strengths over time. And we see, looking at this graph, that Group 1 got stronger compared to Group 2. But this is only accurate on average. On average. So at the group level, this is actually quite helpful. If I knew this study was of a very high quality, and it was done, let's say, on soccer athletes, and I'm working with soccer athletes at the same age level, then this to me would be very useful when I decide on what type of training program I'll implement. However, what we got to be mindful of, that these bar graphs are composed of individual athletes, as illustrated in the other graph. So each one of these black points represents individual athletes. And what we see is that there's a lot of variability. Not everybody responds in the same way. For example, we see the yellow arrow group 1, we see an athlete that actually didn't respond that well to this program. He barely got stronger. So for that particular athlete, implementing that program is not going to be very effective. And this is where the coaching eye comes in. The research can direct you on the big scale picture, but you have to fine-tune and match that to each athlete that you're working with. Alternatively, we see in group 2, we see an athlete, the upper one where the yellow arrow is. He actually responded relatively well to this training intervention. And then for this athlete, he might benefit more than implementing the intervention that was used in group 2. Let's talk about some of the weaknesses. Unfortunately, the scientific enterprise, especially in the sports science, also have weaknesses, and I think it's very important to acknowledge what they are. First, a lot of the studies, a lot of actually the scientific process right now is biased, which is kind of ironic because this is exactly what I mentioned before that the scientific process is trying to avoid and overcome. But there is, for example, what's called a publication bias problem, and it is indeed a big problem, and I'll give you an example of what it is. Let's say scientists around the world conducted over 100 studies, and they wanted to investigate the effects of stretching, static stretching, on recovery. Okay, I'm making this up. This is not necessarily based on real data. And let's say that 20 of these studies found that static stretching improved recovery, but then the other 80 found that it had no effect whatsoever. So we get 80 studies that are finding no effects of stretching on recovery, but then only 20 that found positive effects. In a situation like that, what would you say is probably more accurate, that it has a positive effect or it doesn't have it all? 80 versus 20? Likely that it's not effective. However, what if I told you that only 20 studies that found an effect are the one that get eventually published? Then we're not even going to know of these other 80. And then that could really bias our thinking. It was like, well, listen, there's 20 studies. All of them found that static stretching is effective to assist with recovery. But then we'll not even know about the other 80. And that is a big problem. Now, I can tell you this because I'm quite involved and quite passionate about the topic of bias in sports science. And I can tell you that there's some good news that it is getting better. The system is improving very fast within the sports science discipline and other disciplines as well. It's getting better very fast, but nevertheless, the problem is still there. And I think it's important that you be aware of it when you make decisions. Know the pros, know the cons, and then make an educated decision. The second problem is that it's a very slow process. You as coaches, you need answers now. You can't wait 2 years for a study to be completed. It's too time-consuming. So there's a bit of a mismatch between the pace of coaches and the pace of sports science. Sports science, naturally, to conduct studies takes longer. But you need information now. So that's another problem. The second is that, as I'm sure you know, and this, of course, is a vast generalization, but there's a whole lot of research being done on sports science that is of no use to you. It doesn't apply to your settings. So a lot of the questions that are being answered by scientists is just not relevant to you. And that is, again, that is part of the problem that exists. Part of it stems from the miscommunication between scientists and coaches that should be improved. And then, of course, consuming research is time-consuming. And you guys are busy. You don't have a lot of time. So then you need time to read these papers, and you got to have a lot of background knowledge. You got to understand statistics. Statistics is very difficult and it requires time. So let's just recap the pros and cons of the scientific process. The pros, the benefits, is that it can overcome bias. It's very systematic. We can have larger numbers, larger samples, so we can be more confident in our results. It can establish cause and effect relationship, which is what we're interested in. And it can overcome our reliance on anecdotes. Now, the negative aspects is that it's biased, it's slow, not relevant, it's quite complex, and requires time and background knowledge. Now, of course, by the way, if you can think of any other points that I've missed, both as a strength or a weakness under the research or the experience, I would truly like to hear that, because the list is definitely not final. It's what I was able to think of up until this point. But I truly am open to hearing your opinions. Now we'll move on to the final part of this talk. The 6 strategies that I'll propose that you implement in your work. So this is what's about to come now. I'm going to share with you strategies that will overcome the inherent biases that we suffer from as humans and mental shortcuts. And then I'll provide some strategies that will assist you to better understand and integrate research into your work. Some of them may require time, and I know how busy you all are. And I should also know that you can. I've made a list that you can access it through the website. That it's in the paper in front of you. If you'd like to look at some of the materials that I provided, there's a lot of free stuff there for you to act upon with these strategies. Strategy number 1, and I know, I like to emphasize this point now. What the strategies that I'm going to go over right now, in my honest opinion, is one of the most important things you can do to upgrade yourself as coaches. I honestly and truthfully believe so. Strategy number 1, study your enemies. We just went over a whole list of different cognitive biases that can cloud our better judgment, that can have a negative effect on our decision-making process. So you have to be aware of what they are. You have to be aware of their existence. I'm not sure how many of you knew that the list is so large, knew how much they can impact us and how often they impact us. And this is a very rich topic of research. There's a whole lot of research that looks into how different biases influence us. So what I propose to you is this. Read about them. As simple as that. As simple as that. I guarantee you that you'll find this amusing and interesting. When I read about different cognitive biases, I always find myself smiling. It's like, oh yeah, I've done that in the past, or I can think of somebody else who's done that. So it is fascinating. But most importantly, by reading about the different biases, it has been shown that just by studying and learning about them, it automatically reduces their negative impact on us. And that makes sense, because we can only protect ourselves from what we know that may be influencing us. So the more you read about the different biases and they become explicit in your mind and you know what they stand for, you can actually think and reflect. It's like, wait, I'm now conducting the gambler's fallacy or whatever type of fallacy. And it's like, oh, let's take a step back and reflect upon it. So just by learning about them, you'll already improve your decision-making processes. And this actually, to do this, doesn't require a whole lot of time or effort. What I recommend you do is just use different cheat sheets, just like the one on this presentation, that just really briefly mentions each one of the main different biases. What I recommend you do is print it. You'll have access to it online. You just print it. What I like to do is just have it on the wall or a place that I can look at it quite frequently. Then I'll focus on one of the different one bias at a time, and then just think about it. Like, yeah, I remember doing this, or I remember, and I can tell you I've done this exercise many times with many different people, and within a week afterwards, I get so many responses, people telling me how much they now notice the different biases on themselves and on others. So this is actually an interesting and fun activity to do, which again, should improve your ability to make better decisions. Strategy number 2, what I call the question to ask yourself mostly, but you can also ask others. And what I'm sharing with you right now has been quite intensively investigated and shown to be, again, a very effective strategy to reduce the negative impact of different biases on ourselves. So all it requires is that you frequently ask yourself the following question. Are there alternative explanations for the observed effect? Or put differently, is there a different explanation to why my athlete may have improved, or why my athlete has injured, or any other question, because that helps us overcome a large family of different biases. For example, as an example that I provided before, if you remember with the nutritional supplement, that we tend to create relationships and we look for evidence that supports our belief system and ignore other types of information. But by asking ourselves, wait, could there be some other alternative explanations that can explain what I'm seeing, why my athlete is improving or not? And then if you ask yourself this honestly and try to reflect, you might start thinking about the different explanations represented by the different X's here. And if you do that, you'll be able to perhaps explore different pathways or different explanations that may lead you down the road to make better decisions. Strategy number 3 is a strategy that, based on my experience, a lot of coaches do anyways, which is reflection. You reflect about what you do. I know there's a fair few courses and books on this topic, and based on my own experience, I've learned that a lot of coaches do reflect a fair bit. I'll propose you ask yourself the following questions. Of course, you can take it any other way. You can ask yourself other questions, and you can reflect in any way you found to be effective. But this is what I do when I coach, and I find this to be quite an effective strategy for me. So I ask myself, why did I make this coaching-related decision? Just a first basic question that I ask myself. The second question that I ask myself, is it defensible? And then I sometimes imagine what would happen if a panel of 5 of the most critical and respected coaches that I know would all of a sudden appear in the room and try to grill me. Why did you do this? Why did you do that? And I'd have to answer it. I like doing this mental game, and I find that it really challenges me to try to come up with answers, to try to justify what I've done. And I tend to do this usually after a session, not before. I try to do that to reflect before I go to sleep or after a session is done when I'm driving. And then the next one is what I'd hope you'd perhaps adopt from my lecture here today, is to ask yourself, can I explain my coaching-related decision using the evidence-based figure? The figure on the slide, if you remember that each circle here represents either expertise, research, and client preferences. If you start asking yourself this question and even try to add numbers to it, just of course a mental game, the numbers will not mean anything. But if I say, well, if I had to really pin down my decision, how much of it was based on research, how much of it was based on my experience, and how much of it on client preferences, and I'll be honest with myself, well, I would say that roughly speaking, 70% of my decision was based on my own expertise. I did consider some research, but maybe not enough. And oh, wow, I barely gave my athlete any room to make any decision. It could be that in some cases, if I'll be honest with myself, I'll see that one of these channels will be 0. So once you try to actually think of your decisions in view of this framework, I think it makes the process better and easier. And then lastly, I ask myself, well, what if I'm wrong? What if I'm wrong? What could be the consequences of that? Am I putting my athlete in any risk here, or actually it's not that important? So this is another important question to ask. This is usually the list that I go through. I'm sure that everyone here has their own different questions that they ask themselves. If you had to take one out of the 4 that I proposed, I would definitely go with the one that I would imagine that most of you here haven't done in the past, is try to tie this up with an evidence-based figure and try to maybe break it down. It only has to be within yourselves because, again, the numbers don't really mean anything. It's just to give you an idea of how you broke it down, and then you'd really have to consider hard all the different channels. Strategy number 4 is confusing to many of the coaches that I propose it. This is actually, relatively speaking, the most time-consuming strategy. But nevertheless, I still propose it because I've grew to understand how valuable it could be for coaches, especially nowadays when we have access to so much data. I don't know if you guys are collecting data. I'm sure a majority of you here do. RPEs, heart rate, GPS data, fatigue, whatever else. If you're collecting data over time, then it is actually very beneficial to develop a very basic understanding of statistics. I truly believe that. If I didn't, I wouldn't recommend that. Because in the end of the day, coaching equals to just making decisions in uncertain environments. We constantly work in environments that are uncertain. There's so many unknowns in everything that we do. And the language of uncertainty is statistics or probability. So when I encourage coaches to slightly fine-tune or improve their ability to think in statistical terms, I see so many benefits to that. First, learning basic statistics in view of what I just said right now makes it, I think, you can make some clear connections between statistics and probability in coaching. So just developing that language by itself is of value. Second, if you're collecting data, like I mentioned before, with Excel sheets or whatever else, and this is where a lot of the things are going nowadays with all the accessibility to data points, it's important to develop some understanding of what to do with the data. And the good news is that it's not difficult at all. It is not time-consuming or anything of that nature, but it's very worthwhile. So my recommendation to you is the following. Refresh or learn your knowledge of, first, descriptive statistics. And by descriptive statistics, I'm just referring to refresh your memory of what an average actually means. What is a standard deviation, percents, probabilities. This is not time-consuming. This is the question of a few hours, not more. And I've added a few free courses that you can take that I've taken myself that are free, that are short. You can take on your free time. They're on YouTube or Coursera or edX. You can see some of the list. I've added a course that, to those of you here who may be interested, that is slightly longer. But nevertheless, I would encourage you to do so. 2 more to go. Now, as I hope that I convince you, incorporating scientific knowledge into your decision-making process is very important, but you're busy and you might not have the background knowledge in statistics. Well, perhaps you'll improve on it if you take my previous advice, but let's say that it is very difficult and time-consuming. So what should you do? How should you keep up? I've got 2 simple recommendations for this one. One is to get a prescription to a research digest. So essentially what it is just usually scientists or sports scientists that go over all the studies that have been published on a given topic. They chose the ones that they think are most relevant or of highest quality. They summarize it and they put it out on a monthly basis. This costs a bit. I have a few recommendations for some of the research digests that are out there. I obviously have no conflict of interest. I have no, the people who are doing this have no idea that I'm proposing this, but I trust their products. Also podcasts. You're all scientists, you're all coaches. We've got a lot of free time. We drive, we fly. You got a lot of quote-unquote dead time. I think this is an excellent opportunity to listen to podcasts. On my way to Singapore from Israel, I was able to listen to 3 podcasts, update my knowledge on some things that under other circumstances I wouldn't have the possibility to do so. And again, I've offered a number of recommendations to podcasts that I trust that's in the links. I would also recommend that you consume review papers. And specifically, I recommend that you consume review papers that are published in peer-reviewed journals that are published in a journal called Sports Medicine. What they do over there, it's a journal that is dedicated only to review papers, which is that they take studies on a particular topic, they summarize it, and write a review about that. So for the most part, these types of articles don't require background knowledge, but they summarize all the studies that have been done into one paper. So by doing so, they save a lot of time for you. So look that up, or again, it's on the list that I prepared. And then finally, my last one, and it's intentional that I saved this one for the last. I would highly encourage you to take initiative and contact a sports scientist. Usually, there's miscommunications, and coaches and sports scientists don't always communicate as much as they should. They both coaches and scientists would benefit so much from working together alongside, but that doesn't happen as frequently as it should. And coaches usually are surprised to hear and learn that sports scientists are very happy to assist. They take a lot of I know when coaches contact me about my work, I'm excited, I'm eager to help. And I know that's true with all the other sports scientists that I've worked with. So what you should do is take initiative, because such relationships are what we all need more of. So be the change, be the person that makes the first move. You're not going to believe how much it can be productive in your work and leading to better questions. And then what you can try to do is try to foster relationships in which scientific questions are answered together. So this is it. There's one question left that we'll use your phone for. We went over 6 different strategies that I proposed to you. I'm curious to know which of the 6 do you think can or will help you develop the most as a coach. So if you can take a minute and answer that, this would actually be of value to me to know. This is probably the most important question for me that I'm truly curious about. Here I have no idea what to expect. I got no hypothesis. So far it seems like somewhat of an even split. That's interesting to see that there isn't one overly dominant answer, which I like. I think that everybody can take something else to them. All right. Interesting. Very interesting. Guys, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed the lecture and took something out of it.